Welcome, everybody. Hi, I'm Keith Vitali, and welcome to Sidekick Podcast. And before we get started, say hi to my producer, Corey Gomez. Hi, Corey.
How's it going?
Oh, good, good. Well, guys, I hope you're going to enjoy this episode as much as I am. I have no idea what I'll be talking about, but I know my producers have got some questions for me, and I kind of enjoy this because it's off the cuff and haven't had any chance to formulate an idea or just have to respond as he asks the question. So go ahead, fire away.
Well, I started thinking it's actually one big giant question, although it's broken up into categories. When we were watching the Super Bowl yesterday, like I'm sure all of you were, everybody armchair quarterbacks. Hey, do that, do that. When you watch Ultimate Fighting, oh, if he'd have got that punch instead of the kick, you would have won. Or even when you watch, wrestling. I mean, I know you know it's not real, but you'll still sit there. Well, I would have put this guy with that guy. Everybody armchair quarterbacks. Well, and also in the world of martial arts, everybody's like, boy, who could win in a fight? So I figured, why should I tell you my opinion when you've got a world champion here that can give you his opinion? So I made like the March Madness brackets. Now you'll actually see the brackets for real. And I wrote down here, this is who I think would win everything. He has no idea who these brackets are, who I picked. So I'm gonna fold this up and we'll see at the end if we agree. But so basically, I'm going to name you four matches. It's going to move like a tournament. I want to know who you think would win this fight and why. This
And
is
let me
my
ask you before we
question.
get started, are these movie fights from
No,
characters or are these actual fights of martial artists
these
and the
would be the
stars?
actual martial artists fighting in a, let's say, in a street fight. Anything goes. And I wanted to do that because, you can see I'm a comic book guy. And so, like, comic book guys, like, gee, could Batman beat Deadpool and all. That's all well and good, but it's fake.
Right,
So
right.
I have two, four, six, eight martial artists. They've been in movies, but they're legitimate martial artists. So if anyone, I probably left some out, but you could do tons of these. But I picked what I thought would be if I was a booker and I was making a tournament. This is the fights that I would line up.
Not street fights. Let's do tournament fights.
Tournament. Well,
Street fights you don't know. Street fights a kick in the groin or punch him in the, take his eyes out.
so we want to go with like a tournament, like point tournament or UFC
Well,
five
if
round.
in all of it, any kind of, let's say it's actual, if they're UFC matches, then will be UFC matches. If they're point matches or full contact matches or whatever. But who in a street fight, I don't want to get involved in that only because somebody can kick you in the groin, the fight's over. It could be a girl kicking, Sylvester Stallone in the groin first move, and I go, hey, she's not better than Sylvester, but she kicked him in the groin.
Well, how about do you want to do full contact or MMA?
Same thing. It's the same
Okay,
thing
same thing.
because full contact is full contact. MMA just takes it to the ground. It's just a difference of semantics.
Well, then my first match, Jeff Speakman, Kempo Karate, legitimately trained. I believe who was Jeff Speakman's trainer? Was it Ed Park? Or Ed Parker, I mean, I'm
It
sorry.
could have been Ed Parker, is what I think.
Jeff Speakman, a legitimate Kempo master. And I have in the first round him taking on former kickboxing champion of the world, Don the Dragon Wilson.
Well, I like Speakman. I've spent a week with him in Berlin, in Germany, and great actor, great martial artist. But I'll throw my ads in at the same time with Speakman. No, Don Wilson. I'm not. Don's going to be the answer for a lot of them. But go ahead. I think he's one of the best two or three of all time.
How would you see their fight playing out? Would you see it going? How many rounds would you see it going? What do you think could happen in it? Would it just
Yeah,
be
let's say no. Don Wilson is methodical. He doesn't move in for the knockout punch. He's not an overpowering, powerful person in that way. He's got a dynamic sidekick. He's got great movement and great timing. I don't know if you're familiar with a guy named Superfoot. His name is Bill Wallace. Bill Wallace is one of the best fighters of all time, undefeated. They're the same weight classes. And I asked both of them at two different times who would win between those two or what was it like. And they don't know. They said they did some sparring together in exhibition matches. And I just remember Bill Wallace telling me that Don Wilson had incredible timing, and I know he's got just great hands. But that sidekick's the key to his fight because he keeps you away at bay with a sidekick, so you can't penetrate his defense. And while you're on the outside of his long kicks, then he moves in with his great hands. So yeah, if he was fighting somebody like a Speakman, it might go. Let's say if it's a 3 rounds, it might go all 3 rounds. But in the 3 rounds, he'd have Speakman cornered.
The speed of the Kenpo you don't think would play a factor into it?
It's like I fought kung fu people and world champion kung fu people, and it's a whole different world in the ring. Kung fu works, all that stuff. It looks really pretty in the whole bit, but when you get in the ring, it's still a lot of hardcore straight punches and hooks. You can't really apply the Kempo techniques, takedowns, locks, arm bars. You can, only until you get them on the ground. But if it's a stand-up match, Don Wilson's going to dominate it because he's one of the greatest fighters of all time. And Speakman's great. Like you said, I spent time with him. He's a phenomenal martial artist. I think I'm pretty good martial artist. I'll put myself in the same category as Speakman. We both get beat by Don Wilson.
And I've got Don moving on to the semi. Now, the next one, I mean, this can't happen anymore, but I thought this would be one heck of a pairing. The late Bruce Lee taking on Donnie Yen. How do you see that going?
Wow, that's a good question. That's a very good one. It's so hypothetical. They're both phenomenal athletes. Um, wow, that's a tough one. Donnie Yen is just, he's amazing with his technique. And if Bruce Lee was fighting in Donnie Yen's era, it'd be a closer match. But Donnie Yen, if he was fighting in Bruce Lee's era, when he first erupted across the world, I'd give Bruce Lee the nod. Bruce Lee was just ahead of his time. So he was doing techniques and fighting in a style, strong side forward that other fighters weren't fighting. And I think his straight line approach, Bruce Lee's, would beat Donnie Yen's, his circular movement kung fu. So I'd give Bruce Lee the nod, even though I like Donnie Yen a lot.
What would happen? Here's a very big hypothetical in this. What if the fight went to the ground? Because neither of these guys are known as ground fighters.
I give Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee he was very pragmatic. He studied everything. He studied real life fighting as well, what worked the most, the best, most effective. Whereas Donnie Yen's his style was for self-defense, but a lot of it was movie magic and a lot of the moves, is aesthetically beautiful. But Bruce Lee's was straight to the point. I think Bruce Lee would have kicked him in the groin and hit him, taking him down and just taking him out.
I had a feeling you were going to say Bruce Lee. I that one I really I thought I didn't know how to call that one. Part of me would have I had a reason to argue for both, but so we've got Don and Bruce Lee moving into the semis. Now on the other side of the bracket, now I'm throwing this guy in there because you always compliment what a great martial artist he is. That's Scott Atkins. He's the epitome of the new school of martial arts. I've got him fighting the epitome of the old school of martial arts, Chuck Norris. Who would you give this one to? Norris versus Adkins.
It's like Norris is so talented, his movement, his timing. I really looked up to Chuck Norris, and he was a person that I kind of molded my own fighting style after his. So I have the highest regard for Chuck Norris. But you're talking about a guy who's close to Superman, Scott Adkins. Scott Adkins could do literally a somersault, do a 720 in the air and hit him with a leg, and he'd be going, "Where did that come from?" I would be doing the same. He's just taken the martial arts that Chuck and I learned during our era, and he's really transitioned it to an era that we aren't acquainted with. I've never seen anything like it. It's like trick martial arts that a lot of the form practitioners practice. Scott Atkins, great fight, and of course it wouldn't be quick. because Chuck Norris is one of the smartest fighters ever in the ring. So he would learn to move, and he'd do his side kick, spinning back kick. He would move, but just the speed and the power of Scott Adkins, you know, I could overtake him. Now, the expertise and the experience to be on the hand would benefit Chuck Norris, but I still have to give my friend Scott Atkins the nod. Probably me too. I wouldn't want to be in a ring with a guy that's superhuman.
But Chuck always says, I'm gonna hit you with so many rights, you're gonna be begging for the left. I really
Yeah.
that one surprises me. That one surprised me a lot. I had Chuck
I put
all I
myself in
had
the
Chuck.
same category as Chuck Norris. We're good fighters. We're traditional fighters. We got really good technique. We both got records we can stand on. But when somebody enters the ring that you go, I've never seen that before. We can use our experience to move around and sidekick and circle and try to out. But when you have a really somebody with almost, I've never seen powers that that Scott Atkins. I'm just amazed by what he can do, and if it was just points or whatever, maybe Chuck would get the best of him. But this guy's such a super athlete, and he's just so obsessed. When he gets something, I've researched Scott Adkins, and when he wants to learn something, he just goes full tilt. And if it was his design to be a full contact fighter, he'd be a tough full contact fighter.
So then we've got Adkins moving on to the semi. In the last opening round, I wanted to find two people who had, I'm writing down Adkins if you wonder what I'm doing. Very different styles. One is definitely an attack style. One is definitely an offense. One is definitely a defense. Jackie Chan, we all know is no joke, against Steven Seagal. You have two very different styles, very different sizes. How would you see that one turning out?
Well, Jackie Chan is a phenomenal athlete, but I just think the power, size, um, and speed of Steven Seagal, I just think that it's hard for somebody. Remember, Jackie Chan's probably 150, 60 pounds and 5'10", and Steven Seagal 6'2", probably right. Well, in his prime, he was probably 190, 200. So I give the edge to Steven Seagal, even though Jackie Chan is like, he's as close as you'll ever get to a Scott Atkins. It's a Scott Atkins has better technique and form and speed, whereas Jackie Chan is more versatile, can do anything, jump flips, jump spins, and a whole bit. But just because he throws a technique doesn't mean he's powerful because he's just throwing it. He's more comes from more from the theater side of martial arts.
Now, how do you think that would work with like? And I know two Aikido moves, and I learned those basically. They're just offshoots of judo. Chan's move, he'd have to basically run after Seagal because Seagal's more of a weight approach. You think anything Chan does would even hit Seagal, or you think he would just deflect
The
everything?
ring has is either got a cage like MMA or it's got rings like full contact fighters from the past, but there's nowhere to go. Or from the boxing ring, you're in that ring, and Steven Seagal would just move forward, and Jackie would be doing this acrobatic stuff and probably hitting him and jumping. But once Steven Seagal got his hands on him, he's just so powerful. Then I'd give the edge to Steven Seagal. Not to take anything away from Jackie Chan, I'd have my hands full with Steven Seagal as well. He's just powerful.
Now that moves, we're moving on to the semis. Two semi-round matches. The first one, a lot of people have the way you picked it lines up to some simulations I've seen on YouTube. First semifinal matchup would be Don the Dragon Wilson versus Bruce Lee.
It's like that's blasphemy. Shouldn't even put those two together like that. You know, here's one. Bruce Lee's 135 pounds and ahead of his time, created a whole style and inspired millions. Having said that, if he got in a ring with Don Wilson, 185 pounds, pure power, one of the most beautiful sidekicks you'll ever see. And now, having said that, he got a sidekick from Bruce Lee, watching Bruce Lee sidekick. So he's going to use Bruce Lee's sidekick against Bruce Lee. And here's somebody taller, stronger, and has about, I don't know, 60 fights under his belt, about 20 years of fighting. You have to give the edge to Don Wilson. Now, in a real fight, street fight, totally different because Bruce Lee in a street fight is going to go for your eyes, your groin, and it's going to be a whole different world. But when you put somebody in the ring, you have to be considerate of weight and height and experience. And Bruce Lee, as great as he is or was, Don Wilson's just the epitome of a full contact fighter.
You know, on a side note, let's say for some reason, this is just me being curious. Let's say Bruce Lee got hurt and his substitute was Billy Blanks. Would Don win that one too?
Yes. And Billy is a great fighter, one of the best specimens. During his era, he was the Scott Atkins of his era. Scott Atkins now, he's a little older himself. There's younger guys coming out. And I heard Scott Atkins on the podcast saying he can't even believe what the new generation of martial arts film stars are doing. They're impressing him. But during his era, um, Billy Blanks was the epitome of a RoboCop. I mean, he was like a Dolph Lundgren, 6'1", perfect build, and acrobatic, could do it all. But you can't go against Don Wilson. Don Wilson's going to take him out. Probably wouldn't last a round.
I
And
mean,
I've worked out with trained with him, but just that's how good Don Wilson. Nobody just don't, it's hard to believe how good Don Wilson really is.
well, that puts Don in the finals. So in the other semifinal would be now there's a real big, if you remember by the wins you picked, another big separation of styles. Scott Atkins and Steven Seagal.
I'd go with Scott Adkins, and only because Steven Seagal is so great at jiu-jitsu, so great at the movements. He needs to put his hands on you. Once he gets his hands on you and lock you down and whatever, but you put gloves on him, it's a different world. I think Scott could train, and he could even make up for the difference in size and weight. And I think Scott would prevail. It's all hypothetical. All these guys are going to be pissed off at me, and it's not like a Steven Seagal. You're a great fighter. You probably could knock them all out, but who knows? But this is just my opinion. I think the world of Scott Adkins and his ability.
I mean, there's no real way to counter. And let me point in, these are my questions. Keith didn't make me, he didn't know I was going to ask him, so no disrespect. And I love all these guys too. I'm a big fan, but how would something like a pirouette kick, like a big three jump kick that Atkins does, is there any way like Seagal could counter that?
Yeah, he could, and he would, and you would not see him doing this. Scott wouldn't be doing those type of movements. Billy Blanks would. Billy is the kind that liked the aerobatic kind of. He almost developed or was credited as developing one of the kicks where you flip over, and he would use that all the time. The problem with that is it great for movies, it's great for show, and it even works from time to time, but not against the very best. So while you're flipping in the air, the guy's sidestepping you and kick you in the head as you're flipping in the middle of it. So I don't think Scott Atkins would try to use those type of acrobatic techniques, but he just got so much skill that I think he would overcome.
Well, then that leaves the final of new school and old school. Don the Dragon Wilson versus Scott Atkins. That would be the big final championship match. How would you see that going down?
That'd be a great match, but I'd give the edge to Don Wilson. You can't minimize 60 fights and 20 years of fighting. And even though I think the world is of Scott Adkins, and if he was to start training for a solid year, that 1 year would make up for the 20 years that Don had as experience. Now, you left off some of the best fighters of all time. You want me to throw some other names at you?
Oh
First of
yeah,
all,
I left tons off.
yeah, that's true. But I mean, but in the same, and actually, Benny Urquidez is an actor and fighter, and he is in the same camp as Don Wilson. He has 60 fights. I think Don had 76 or something like that, or 80 fights. Benny Urquidez has 60 fights, but these are two almost just incredible fighters, right? Then we had other guys in the PKA They were fighting at the time. Both of these fighters fought as well. We had Jeff Smith, Joe Louis, and Bill Wallace. Those three were the very best at one time. It was so disconcerting and frustrating for all of us as fans that the best three undefeated, Jeff Smith was light heavy, Bill Wallace was middle, Joe Louis was the heavyweight. All three were PK fighters. All three retired undefeated. All three were just, we couldn't wait to see how they would match up against what we called international fighters. International fighters from a different league, the Benny Urquidez's and Don Wilson's, because they kick below the belt. Because international fighters don't only kick from the waist up, that's PKA. The international fighters incorporate leg kicks, once in a while elbows, but most of the time leg kicks. And when Don Wilson would go to Japan or Benny would go to Japan, they'd have to fight by their rules. I was always, it's one of the mysteries of life. What would have happened if Don Wilson, being a light heavyweight or middleweight, because he could fight them all, would go, how would he do against Bill Wallace and do against Jeff Smith, both undefeated? And both and both undefeated, and both of them are so great that there's camps on both sides that would be screaming right now, watching it, going, "Oh, it's Jeff Smith, it's Bill Wallace," and there's others be going, "No, it's Benny Urquidez and it's Don Wilson." But I have to, and Joe Louis too. There's a time Joe Louis was almost unbeatable. End of his career, he was coming back when he was a little older and he's getting beaten a little bit. But during his heyday, those three were the best ever in American history. And then Don Wilson and Benny Urquidez, they didn't compete with PKA that much, even though Don Wilson's first fight was PKA. But really, they traveled the world circuit. So who's really better? Those that fought mainly in America and competed, or like the three PK fighters. Once in a while, they fight people from France or wherever, but most of the time they were fighting American fighters. Or is it better? Should you put more weight on Don Wilson, being Urquidez, who were undefeated, and they were fighting all over the world? I'm talking about going right into the backyards of Japanese fighters and Thai fighters. These are the toughest fighters on this planet, and defeating everybody, all comers. So that's the discussion I've had, inner dialogue for myself. And right now, if I got it down to two best in my mind, out of all of them, Bill Wallace is undefeated, so you can't say he would ever be beaten. Jeff Smith, he's one of the smartest, most powerful fighters. I don't think he would ever be beaten during his heyday. But Benny Urquidez and Don Wilson fighting each other. Oh, I don't even know. Now, Don has about 20 pounds on him. We're talking about two of the toughest fighters in the history of the world. And I spent time fighting Benny Urquidez. I hit Benny Urquidez with one of the hardest techniques I've ever hit in my life. And I mean, just full power round kick right in the bridge of the nose. And my whole foot was throbbing afterwards. And he just looked at me and smiled. And I stopped. I said, "You don't feel that?" And he didn't even feel it. And even though I'm knocked out, I can't tell you how many people I've knocked out with that kick. And I hit him harder than any of those people hit Benny, just point blank, full power, bam, and hit him. And he just looked at me and smiled and looked at me and says, "You ready?" And I went, "Ready for what?" And I said, "You didn't feel that?" So there's intangibles besides records, intangibles, heart. Benny Urquidez, he claims to have the greatest heart. I mean, he won't give up. You'd have to stab him to stop him. Don Wilson, he's got that sidekick and that movement and that power, and he fights heavyweights, middleweights, light. He fights them all. But I can't slight Bill Wallace, Joe Louis, or Joe Louis, Bill Wallace, and Jeff Smith. To my mind, those are the three greatest American heroes ever. And during that era, but they were PKA fighters, different than the international fighters.
Now, I'll tell you, I must have been way off. Here's my pick. I wrote it down earlier that I thought would have won the whole tournament. And this is what I would have bet all my money, my cryptocurrency money on. I picked Chuck Norris.
Yeah, and it's not to say that
I thought he could have wiped the floor with all of them. I won't lie.
He's 5'10", 160 pounds when he competed. And he just had incredible movement and timing and speed. It's just some of these guys are bigger, faster and smarter, not smarter, but bigger and faster and stronger. Like you said, I modeled my fighting career after Chuck Norris. I told him that, and the reason I told him that is I said, Chuck, you're not the strongest or the fastest or the heaviest. And another person that I just looked up to was the quarterback for the 49ers. What was his name back in the day? Just went blank. He was at the Super Bowl last night. Anyway, that quarterback, I think, is one of the best quarterbacks in the history of football. But he didn't have the best arm. He wasn't as fast as he wasn't the strongest. But it had nothing to do with any of that. He was just the best quarterback. That's just Chuck Norris. You put Chuck Norris in a ring with anyone, and it doesn't mean he's going to lose because somebody is stronger or faster. He was the smartest, probably, of all the fighters that you've mentioned. He's up there in the Bruce Lee category when it comes to intelligence.
Could he have beaten Bruce Lee in real life? Now, I'm not talking about the Chinese connection or Return of the Dragon. I'm sorry. Real life fight between the two. I've always said Chuck because he was actually a competitor. Could Chuck beat Bruce Lee?
I think so. I think Bruce Lee, and during his time too, I think, of course, Bruce Lee is a better technician, better specimen, but he's better specimen than everybody on the planet. So that's not, saying anything negative about Chuck Norris because this guy was built like Tarzan. But Chuck Norris, he's fighting somebody close to his size, his weight, and Chuck had a lot more experience in the ring. So I'd give the nod to Chuck Norris. But you can never count out Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee's incredible because he's the person that put martial arts on the map in my book and inspired millions and millions of people.
So I guess our big tournament winner for this was, and he'll be happy, Don the Dragon Wilson would wipe the floor in a full contact. Don the Dragon would come out on top.
Give me 1 second. I'm gonna look at some. Can you pull up real fast? Pull up on Google. Look for the 49 quarterback
Yeah,
from the 70s. He was
let's take a look. I
real
want to say
fast. I
Joe
don't want to slight
Montana,
him.
but I know that's
Joe
not it.
Montana. That's
Was
it. That's
it?
him. That's him.
Was
Joe
it?
Montana.
Okay.
Yeah. Joe Montana to me, he's in the same category as Tom Brady and now with Mahomes. But oh yeah, I'm talking about this quarterback is so fantastic, so smart. But you see, my point is he wasn't the biggest, the strongest, or the fastest. Joe Montana just had that heart. He had the experience, and he was cool, calm under pressure.
Question of a March Madness in February tournament. And yes, we've got Don the Dragon going all the way. So thanks for doing this. And once again, I must stress he didn't know I was going to ask him this. And I'm fans of all these guys. No slight to anyone.
All right, well, good. Well, listen, thanks. I hope the audience liked it. And if you do, please, I want you to like it and share it. And always be sure to subscribe. Until next time, ciao.